His hand was around her throat before she finished the sentence. Not tight. Just enough that she felt her own pulse slam against his palm, frantic like something trying to escape a cage it had built for itself. "Say it again," Kedman said. "Tell me again that you're sorry." Branwen didn't look away from him. She never did, not even now, not even with his claws not quite extended against her skin, close enough that she could feel the question in them. "I'm not sorry," she said. "I never said I was." Behind him, the great hall was empty except for the 2 iron braziers still burning from the feast that had ended badly 3 hours ago, and a wine cup someone had dropped, rolling in a slow circle on the stone, not quite willing to stop. He let her go like she disgusted him. 3 years he had hated this woman. 3 years of building a throne back up out of the wreckage she'd supposedly left it in. Stone by stone, debt by debt, alliance by humiliating alliance. And now the council had put her back in front of him like a debt finally come due. And his wolf, the part of him that was supposed to hate her more than the man did, was straining toward her so hard his jaw ached from holding it still. Let me tell you how it started. Because you need to understand what he thought she took from him before I tell you what she actually gave. 5 years before that night in the hall, Kedman was 23, and already wearing a crown that didn't sit right on him yet, inherited too early, from a father who died mid-sentence at a border treaty, leaving a son who had never been taught how to survive his own court. The wolf packs of the Northern Reach were not kind to young kings. They tested them the way wolves test a wounded animal. Not all at once, but in small bites, to see how much blood it takes before the thing stops moving. Cadman's bite came from House Pharaoh, a noble line that had wanted the throne for 2 generations and had finally found, in him, a king green enough to be broken. They forged letters in his hand. They paid a witness to swear he'd struck a bargain with the wolves of the Iron Coast to sell border grain during a famine. Treason dressed as commerce, the kind that gets kings burned alive in the square while their own packs watch, and do nothing to stop it. The proof was airtight. The proof was also entirely false. And the only person who could have unmade it, who held the real ledger, the real letter, the real name of who had actually struck that bargain, was a merchant's daughter named Branwen, 20 years old, with a faint white scar through her left eyebrow where a horse had thrown her at 12. The kind of detail nobody notices until they're close enough to kiss her. She had the ledger. She'd kept the real records for House Pharaoh, without knowing at first what they were building toward. When she understood, when she saw what they intended to do to a king who hadn't yet done anything wrong except inherit too soon, she had 2 choices. Expose House Pharaoh, and watch them drag 3 other noble houses, down with them in a civil war that would have torn the Northern Reach in half, and left the borders open to the Iron Coast wolves who actually had been selling grain to enemies, or take the blame herself, smaller, containable. A merchant's daughter caught helping forge the king's signature for personal profit was a scandal. A sitting alpha king caught colluding in a famine trade was an execution in a war. She chose the smaller fire. She let them say her name in the square instead of his. She let Kedman believe, because it was the only story that would hold the kingdom together, that she alone had nearly cost him his throne for coin. She has never once told him otherwise. Not in 5 years, not even now. With his hand finally off her throat and his eyes still doing that thing where they search her face like there's an answer hiding in it he can't read. "You're still going to look at me like that," he said. "Not a question. Like what? Like I'm the one who should apologize." She almost laughed. Almost. "I stopped expecting that a long time ago. That's the wound. That's the spark. Keep both of those things in your chest. Because by the end of this story, they're going to mean something very different than they do right now." The council didn't bring her back out of mercy. They brought her back because the Iron Coast wolves were massing again at the border. The same ones who'd actually sold the grain 5 years ago. The same threat that had never gone away just because a woman took the fall for it. And the only surviving witness who could identify their courier, the one who'd carried gold between House Pharaoh and the Iron Coast, was Branwen. She'd kept that name too. She'd kept a great many names. Sedmon's beta, a broad-shouldered man named Wendell, with a notch missing from his left ear where a wolf bite had taken it clean off in a border skirmish, delivered the news to the king with the particular care of a man who knows his alpha is about to do something stupid. "She stays in the East Wing," Kedman said. "Under guard. I want nothing to do with her beyond what's required." "You'll need to debrief her yourself," Wendell said. "She won't talk to anyone but you. Says you're the only one in this castle who already knows how to hate her properly, so there's no pretending left to do." Kedman's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on something bitter that wouldn't go down. "Fine," he said. "Once. Tonight." It was not once. It was not just that night. She came to him in the small council chamber, with her wrists unbound. He'd ordered that much at least. Some scrap of mercy he wouldn't examine too closely, and a borrowed gray cloak that didn't fit her too long in the sleeve. The fire was the only light. She smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. That metal tang the air gets right before a storm breaks, and underneath it, something warmer he refused to name. His wolf noticed before he did. His wolf always noticed first, and it had been straining toward her since she walked through the door, a low animal hum under his ribs that felt disturbingly like relief. "The courier goes by Asher Crane," she said without preamble. "Burn scar down the right side of his jaw, old. Looks like a brand. He'll be at the Iron Coast crossing within the fortnight, or he won't come at all and you'll have lost your only thread. Why should I trust a single word out of your mouth? You don't have to trust me. You just have to use the information correctly. Which is the only thing I've ever asked of you, and the only thing you've never managed to do." He crossed the room faster than a man should be able to move in a space that small, until there was barely a hand's width between them, until she had to tilt her chin to keep looking at him instead of his throat. "You forged my signature," he said, low. "I didn't. You sold my grain." "I didn't do that either." "Then say what you did do." His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that she heard 5 years of a question he'd never once asked her directly. She looked at him for a long moment, the firelight doing something unfair to the planes of his face, and felt the old, familiar ache of almost telling him. Almost. "I did what was necessary," she said instead. "Hate me for that, if you need somewhere to put it." He didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then he stepped back so abruptly it was like he'd been burned. "Get out," he said. "Wendell will bring you the maps in the morning." She left without looking back, which was the only mercy she had left to give him, because if she had looked back, she would have seen an alpha king standing alone in a cold room, with his hand pressed flat against his own chest, like he was checking whether his heart was still where he'd left it. That was the first night. There would be 11 more before the fortnight was out, and every one of them would cost both of them something they weren't tracking the same way. Here is the thing about forced proximity that nobody warns you about. It doesn't soften hatred slowly. It compresses it. 2 people who can't stand to be in a room together, put in that room together every night for a war council that requires her knowledge and his authority, develop a kind of terrible intimacy out of pure repetition. The way she always sat with her back to the east wall because it had 1 door instead of 2. The way he drummed 2 fingers against his thigh exactly 4 times before he disagreed with someone. The way neither of them would be the first to leave a silence unfilled. By the 6th night, they'd stopped performing courtesy entirely and simply spoke in the clipped, efficient shorthand of 2 people who'd memorized each other's worst angles. By the 8th night, something else had crept in alongside it, uninvited, unwanted, and entirely unmistakable. It happened over a map. She'd leaned across the table to point at a river crossing, and he'd leaned the same direction at the same moment. to block her hand from a pin she was about to misplace, and their fingers had ended up half an inch apart on cracked parchment, neither of them moving, both of them very aware of the half-inch. His wolf rose in his chest like something surfacing for air. He pulled his hand back first. He told himself that meant he'd won something. "You're trembling," she said, not looking up. "I'm not. Your wolf is." "My wolf," he said, "has terrible judgment. At least you agree on something." He almost smiled. He caught himself before it landed, the way you catch yourself before a fall, too late to undo the lean but in time to stop the crash. Wendell, standing by the door with his ruined ear, angled toward the hallway like he was listening for something more interesting out there than two people, failing to admit they wanted to put their hands on each other, cleared his throat loudly enough to be heard in the next county. "The patrol reports, Your Grace." "Later," Kedman said, too fast. Branwen's mouth twitched, just barely. He saw it, and hated that he'd looked for it. By the 10th night, the War Council had thinned to the two of them, more often than not. The others dismissed for reasons that grew flimsier each time, and the air between them had taken on a charge that neither of them named because naming it would have made it real, and making it real would have required one of them to ask a question the other wasn't ready to answer. She'd started noticing the unique cadence of his breath when he was holding himself back from something. 3 short, 1 long, like a wolf pacing a fence line. He'd started noticing that she only ever touched the scar through her eyebrow when she was lying about something small to avoid lying about something large. "Why won't you just tell me what really happened?" he asked her, on the 10th night, quieter than he meant to. 5 years and you've never once defended yourself. Not to the court, not to the executioner's block they nearly put you on, not to me. Why? Would it have mattered? You'd already decided. "Tell me anyway." She studied him, really studied him, the tired lines starting at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, the way his crown sat heavier on him now, not because it had gotten bigger, but because he had. And something in her wanted, badly, dangerously, to finally put the weight down. "Some debts," she said, "aren't mine to forgive myself out of. Ask me again when it matters less. It matters now." "Then I suppose," she said, standing, gathering the borrowed cloak around her like armor, "we're both going to be disappointed." She left him with that. He sat at the table long after she'd gone, running his thumb along the half-inch gap on the parchment where their hands had almost met, and didn't examine, not yet, why it felt less like satisfaction and more like grief. 2 nights later, Asher Crane was captured at the Iron Coast, crossing exactly where she'd said he'd be, burn scar and all. And under interrogation, he gave up 3 names from House Pharaoh's old network, still drawing breath and still drawing coin from the Iron Coast wolves. It should have been a triumph. Cadman should have felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a debt finally being collected after 5 years. Instead, he stood on the battlement that night, with the wind doing something unkind to the torches, and found himself thinking about a scar through an eyebrow and a woman who answered every accusation with the same maddening, infuriating refusal to defend herself, and his wolf, already half feral with wanting something it had no business wanting, chose that exact moment to surface fully for the first time in years, not in fury, but in a low, aching pull toward the east wing, toward her window, toward the simple animal fact of her continued existence in the same building as him. He gripped the stone battlement until his knuckles went white and did not go to her window. That restraint cost him more than the fight with House Pharaoh ever had. The midpoint came from a place neither of them controlled, a fire. It started in the East Wing archive, the one room in the castle where the old House Pharaoh records had been quietly stored and quietly forgotten, 3 nights after Crane's capture, in the dead hours when the castle was at its thinnest. Branwen smelled smoke before any alarm bell rang, that particular acrid bite of old parchment catching, sharper than wood smoke, ugly in the back of the throat, and she was through the archive door and into the heat before she'd even decided to move, because she knew, with a certainty that turned her stomach to ice, exactly which shelf the original ledger sat on. The real one. The one that had never been destroyed because some stubborn, self-punishing part of her had kept it hidden for 5 years as the only proof of what she'd actually done, in case she ever needed it, in case she ever found the courage to use it. Kedman found her on her knees in smoke thick enough to chew, one arm wrapped around a fireproofed strongbox, the other dragging herself toward the door she could no longer see, and his wolf made the decision before the man did. He had her out of that room in 11 seconds into a corridor whose stones had never felt so blessedly cold, and he did not let go of her for a full minute after the danger had passed. Both of them coughing, both of them shaking. His hand fisted in the back of her borrowed cloak like he was afraid, the moment he released it, she'd simply combust on principle. "What in the gods' names," he managed, "made that worth your life?" She didn't answer. She was still holding the strongbox like a drowning woman, holds driftwood, and something in the rigid, protective set of her shoulders finally cracked the question open in him that he'd been circling for 10 nights and refusing to ask directly. "What's in the box, Branwen?" "Nothing that's yours to know yet. It is exactly mine to know. Everything in this castle is mine to know." "This isn't," she said, and her voice broke on it in a way he'd never once heard in 5 years of hating her. "This is the only thing in 5 years that's ever been mine. He should have let it go." He didn't. He took the box from her hands, gently, which surprised them both, and when she didn't fight him for it, when she simply closed her eyes like a woman finally setting down something she'd carried so long. Her arms had forgotten how to be empty. He understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, that whatever was inside was about to undo something he'd built his entire understanding of the last 5 years upon. He opened it in the small council chamber an hour later, with her sitting across from him, not defending herself, not explaining, just watching him read with the exhausted stillness of someone who has rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times and never once expected to survive it intact. The ledger was real. The handwriting was Lord Pharaoh's, not hers, not the forged signature she'd supposedly profited from. There was no forged signature, there had never been one. There was only a true and damning record of House Pharaoh selling border grain to the Iron Coast during the famine, with 3 other noble houses' seals attached as silent partners, enough names to have split the kingdom into civil war the moment it surfaced. And beneath it, in her own hand, a single page. A letter she had written and never sent, addressed to no one. The kind of letter people write only to make a decision feel real to themselves. It said, in part, that she understood what exposing the truth would do. Not just to him, but to every soldier who'd die in the war 4 houses, turning on a green king, would ignite. And that she had decided, alone, at 20 years old, that she would rather be hated by one man for a lie than be the reason thousands of men died for a truth that could wait. Kedman read it twice. The second time, his hands weren't steady. "You didn't ruin me," he said. It wasn't a question. It came out of him like something being pulled by the root. "No. You saved the entire Reach from a war and let me spend 5 years hating you for it instead. I needed you to hate me convincingly," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very flat, the voice of someone who has practiced staying calm about the worst thing that ever happened to her so many times it no longer sounds like pain, which is its own kind of pain. "If you'd known the truth, you'd have torn House Pharaoh apart publicly out of pride, and the war would have happened anyway, just 5 years sooner, while you were too young and too unsteady on the throne to survive it. I needed the scandal small. I needed it to be me. You let an entire kingdom believe you'd betrayed your king for coin. I let an entire kingdom believe a story that kept it standing. There's a difference, even if it never looked like one from where you were sitting." He stood up so fast, the chair scraped a furious line across the stone, and for a moment she thought, with a strange, detached calm. That he might finally do the thing she'd spent 5 years steeling herself for. Hate her even more now, for having made the decision for him, for having taken his pride and his ignorance and used both to keep him alive. Instead, he crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up, and said the only true thing he had left in him. I hunted you for 5 years for something you did to save my life, and you let me. Yes. Why? Because the alternative was watching you burn for something that wasn't a lie at all. And I'd already decided, the moment I understood what House Pharaoh had built, that I would rather carry the lie myself than watch that happen. She looked at him steadily, scar through her eyebrow catching the firelight, the only physical mark on her that the whole kingdom had stared at in the square 5 years ago, without once asking how it got there. I didn't do it for gratitude, Caedmon. I never expected you to know. I'm only telling you now because you finally found the box, not because I decided you'd earned it. That should have landed like absolution. It landed instead like an accusation, because the truth underneath her words was unmistakable. She had never planned to tell him. She had been prepared to let him hate her until one of them died, and that, more than the fire, more than 5 years of false blame, was the thing that finally broke something open in his chest he didn't have language for yet. Here is your second open loop. The one I promised would sit unresolved until the very end. If she never planned to tell him, if the fire was an accident and not a confession she'd been working toward, then what, exactly, was she planning to do with the rest of her life? Hold that question. We're not done with it. What followed was not gratitude. It was worse, in the way that truth is always worse than the comfortable lie you'd built a whole personality around. Caedmon spent the next several days in a state his court had never seen from him, quiet where he used to be commanding, distracted in council where he used to be sharp, prone to standing at windows that faced the east wing for stretches of time long enough that Wendell, Earnotch, and all, finally said what no one else dared. You're going to lose her, Wendell said. The same way you lost 5 years, by being too proud to say the thing out loud. I don't know what to say to her. Try the truth. I hear it's fashionable in your family this week. Caedmon went to find her that night and discovered, with a fresh and specific kind of horror, that she was already packing. You're leaving. My debt to the crown was the courier's name. I gave you that. I gave you the ledger because the fire forced my hand, not because I intended to stay and watch you decide what to do with it. She didn't look at him while she said it, folding the borrowed gray cloak with more care than the garment deserved. You have what you need. House Pharaoh's remaining names, the Iron Coast Network, the truth, finally, for whatever that's worth to you now. I don't need to be in this castle for any of that to matter. And if I don't want you to go. Her hands stilled on the cloak. Don't, she said very quietly, do that to me now. Not after 5 years of the opposite. This is where he did the disappointing thing, the one I warned you was coming, because no reckoning worth having lets the hero off easy. He reached for her, finally, after 11 nights of restraint, of half inches and almost touches, and instead of saying the thing that might have actually held her there, he said, Stay because I'm ordering it. As your king. It was the wrong thing in every possible way, and he knew it the instant it left his mouth, watched it land on her face like a slap, watched 5 years of careful, hard-won dignity snap back into place like a door closing. I spent 5 years letting you hate me to save your throne, she said. And you'd spend the rest of it commanding me to stay instead of asking. No. She picked up the bag. I'd rather you hate me honestly than want me as an order. At least the hatred was never confused about what it was. She left that night. He let her, because some part of him, the proud, wounded, 23-year-old part that had never fully grown past the year his throne nearly burned, genuinely believed, for one catastrophic week, that a king didn't chase, that a king commanded, and the world arranged itself accordingly. And if it didn't, The failure belonged to the world, and not to him. The world did not arrange itself accordingly. 3 weeks passed. House Pharaoh's remaining conspirators were rounded out, using her ledger and her testimony, sent by Raven, never delivered in person, because she had not come back to deliver it herself, and he had not gone to ask her to. The Iron Coast network collapsed under the weight of its own exposed names. The kingdom, by every measure that mattered to a court, was saved, vindicated, secured. Kedmon should have felt triumphant. He felt instead like a man standing in a house, with all the furniture removed, wondering why the rooms had gotten so loud. It was Wendell, again, who finally said the thing plainly. Standing in the same small council chamber, where the ledger had first been opened, the firelight throwing the same shadows it always had, except now the chair across the table sat empty in a way that had started to feel less like absence and more like accusation. "You won," Wendell said. "Everyone in the Reach knows it. Why do you look like a man who lost?" "Because I did," Kedmon said. And it was the first time in 5 years he'd said something that simple and that true out loud. "I spent 5 years hating the wrong story, and the 1 week I had to fix it, I gave her an order instead of an apology. I don't know how a king begs." "You don't beg as a king," Wendell said. "You beg as the wolf. Try that instead." He rode east alone, no guard, no crown. He left it on the table in the small council chamber, which Wendell noted with the closest thing to satisfaction his stoic face ever produced, and found her 3 days later in a coastal trading town that smelled of salt and tar and fish left too long in the sun. The kind of place a woman goes when she wants to disappear into something loud enough to drown out a king. She was behind a merchant's stall when he found her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, haggling over the price of dyed wool with a stubbornness that made the merchant laugh despite himself, and for one suspended second before she saw him, Kedmon got to watch her exist entirely outside of him. Unguarded, unburdened, simply a woman with a scar through her eyebrow, living a life that had nothing to do with the throne she'd nearly died protecting. Then she saw him, and the ease left her face all at once, replaced by something far more guarded, and he understood that he had exactly one chance to say this correctly. "I came to apologize," he said, "and then to ask you something, in that order, because I made the mistake of doing it backwards once already, and I won't do it again." "I'm listening. I'm sorry I ordered you to stay instead of asking. I'm sorry it took me 5 years and a fire to learn the difference between the woman who ruined me and the woman who bled to keep me standing. I'm sorry I let my pride decide what kind of story to believe for half a decade, when the truth was sitting in a box you nearly died protecting." His voice didn't crack this time. It had nothing left to hide behind. "I don't have a crown with me. I don't have a court watching. I'm asking you, not commanding you, would you come back? Not because the kingdom needs your testimony. Because I do, and I have no claim to make on you beyond that, and I know it." She set down the wool she'd been haggling over. The merchant wisely found something urgent to do at the other end of his stall. "You hunted me for 5 years," she said. "What makes you think wanting me now erases that?" "Nothing erases it," he said. "I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of however long you'll have me proving I finally understand it." His wolf was loud in his chest now, no longer something to suppress, simply something true he'd stopped fighting. "I'm not here for a fated bond, Branwen. I'm not here because some scent pull in my blood finally got loud enough to win. I'm here because I read a letter you wrote to no one when you were 20 years old, deciding alone to save thousands of lives at the cost of your own name, and I have not been able to stop thinking about the kind of person who makes that choice and never once asks for credit." She was quiet for a long moment, the gulls loud overhead, the salt wind doing something unkind and necessary to both their eyes. "I don't want to be chosen because I sacrificed something," she said finally. "I've spent 5 years being defined by what I gave up for you, If I come back, I need it to be because of who I am when I'm not giving anything up at all. Then let me find out who that is, he said. I have time. I intend to use all of it. That's your second open loop closing. If you were holding on to it, she never planned to tell him, never planned to stay, because she had spent 5 years building an identity entirely out of sacrifice. And the real question was never whether he'd choose her. It was whether she would let herself be chosen for something other than the worst thing that ever happened to her. She didn't answer him with words. She picked the wool back up, set it down again, and reached out. Finally, after 11 nights of half inches and 1 entire continent's distance, and pressed her palm flat against his chest. Over the place where his heart was working too hard, the first deliberate touch either of them had allowed themselves in 5 years of circling. He covered her hand with his own and didn't say anything at all, because some things, when they finally arrive, don't need narrating. They rode back to the Reach together 3 days later, and if you want the part where House Pharaoh's last conspirators groveled before the throne, where the court that had jeered her in the square 5 years ago now stood and watched her walk in beside their king with her chin level and her scar uncovered and her name finally spoken without an accusation attached to it. You'll get a piece of that, because the title promised you a reckoning, and a reckoning is owed. It happened on a gray morning 3 weeks after the coastal town, in the same great hall where Caedmon's hand had once closed around her throat. The remaining Pharaoh conspirators, 2 lords stripped of seals, a steward who'd carried gold across the border for a decade, were marched before the throne in chains that caught no light at all, and it was Branwen's testimony, not the king's accusation, that sealed each of their fates because the court understood by then exactly whose evidence had always been correct. One of the lords, gray-haired, a thin white line of old scar tissue along his collarbone where a long Ago wolf had marked him for insubordination decades back, made the mistake of sneering at her as the verdict was read. A merchant's daughter, he spat, deciding the fate of nobles. A merchant's daughter, Caedmon said, before she could answer for herself, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without him raising it. Who's held this kingdom together with her own hands while the rest of you were busy selling it for coin? You'll address her with the respect due someone who has done more for this throne than every name in your bloodline combined. He didn't look at the Lord again after that. He looked at her. I owe her a debt no chain or verdict will settle. The least this hall can do is stop pretending otherwise. The gray-haired lord said nothing further. There was nothing left for him to say that wouldn't cost him his tongue. That was the reckoning the court witnessed. The one that mattered happened later, in private, the way the truest things in this story always had. He found her on the same battlement where he'd once stood gripping the stone until his knuckles went white, refusing to let himself want what he wanted. She was watching the horizon do the slow gray work of turning into evening, and he came to stand beside her, not touching, close enough that the half-inch between their hands on the stone railing had become, somehow, the most familiar measurement either of them owned. I'm not asking for a bond, he said. Not tonight. I know what that would mean to you, after everything, being claimed instead of chosen. I won't do that to you. I know, she said. I just wanted you to know that if you ever decide you want one, it won't be because my wolf finally got loud enough to win. It'll be because I've spent every day since the coast learning the difference between hunger and love, and I'd rather wait until I'm certain than rush something you'll spend years wondering if you really wanted. She turned to look at him then, Scar catching the last gray light, and something in her face had finally, fully unguarded itself. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter than either. Something closer to a held breath finally let go after 5 years of holding it. Ask me again in a year, she said. Not because I doubt you. Because I want to know what it feels like to be asked by a man who isn't trying to make up for anything anymore. Just a man who wants me. A year, he said. A year. He didn't kiss her that night. He wanted to. His wolf wanted to so badly it ached behind his ribs like a wound reopening. The good kind. The kind that means something's finally healing correctly. But he'd learned, finally, the cost of taking what hadn't been freely offered yet. And so instead he simply laced his fingers through hers, on the cold stone railing. No half-inch left between them at all, and they stood there together until the horizon finished its slow gray work, and the first stars came out over a kingdom that had, after everything, survived itself. A year is a long time to tell in a single image, so I won't try. I'll give you only this. On a morning exactly 1 year later, in the same great hall in front of a court that had long since stopped whispering her name like an accusation, Sedmund knelt, not as a king commanding, not as a wolf claiming, but as a man asking, and Branwen, scar uncovered, chin level, chose him back, not because she'd sacrificed everything for him once and owed him the rest. Because she wanted to. The gray-haired lord who'd once sneered at her in chains was long since exiled from the Reat entirely, his name struck from every record that mattered. And nobody in that hall remembered to mourn it. What they remembered, instead, the thing they'd tell their own children for years after, was the way the Alpha King's hands shook when he finally slid a mate mark bracelet of plain, unadorned iron. No jewels, nothing claimed, nothing owned, onto the wrist of the woman they'd once watched him hate, and the way she didn't cry, didn't tremble, simply looked down at her own wrist like she was seeing, for the first time in 5 years, a story about herself that was finally, entirely true.